There is a story, possibly true, possibly too perfect to be entirely true, which in Diogenes' case amounts to the same thing, about a meeting between two of the greatest minds of the ancient world. Alexander the Great, fresh from his conquests, flush with the kind of power that makes ordinary men forget what they are, sought out Diogenes of Sinope, the philosopher he had heard so much about. He found him lying in the sun outside his barrel, doing nothing in particular. Alexander stood over him and said that he was the most powerful man in the world, and that he would grant Diogenes anything he wished. Diogenes looked up at him and said, "Stand out of my sunlight." Alexander, it is reported, walked away and told his companions that if he were not Alexander, he would want to be Diogenes. The most powerful man in the world had just been dismissed by a man who owned nothing, and the most powerful man in the world knew, in that moment, that the man who owned nothing had something he did not. This is the beginning of one of the most uncomfortable philosophical traditions in human history. Uncomfortable because it does not flatter. Uncomfortable because it does not console. Uncomfortable because it looks at the life most people are living and says, with complete calm and no apology, you are doing it wrong. The philosophy is called cynicism, from the Greek kynikos, meaning dog-like. The name was originally an insult. Diogenes and his followers lived so far outside the norms of polite society that their contemporaries compared them to stray dogs, animals with no shame and no pretension who took what they needed and ignored everything else. Diogenes accepted the comparison with satisfaction. Dogs, he pointed out, do not perform. They do not dress to impress, accumulate wealth to signal status, or say things they do not mean to people they do not respect. Dogs live according to their nature. Human beings, in Diogenes' observation, almost never do. Instead, they construct elaborate systems of pretense, careers built on appearances, relationships maintained for social utility, identities assembled from external materials and presented to the world as if they were real. And they do all of this in the sincere belief that it is making them happy. Diogenes watched this. He watched it in Athens, the most sophisticated city in the ancient world, among the most educated and accomplished people of his era. And his conclusion was simple, devastating, and 2,500 years ahead of its time. The things you are chasing are not making you free. They are making you a slave to the opinion of people who are themselves slaves to the opinion of other people. The only way out is to stop. Diogenes was born around 412 BC in Sinope, a prosperous Greek trading colony on the Black Sea coast. His father, Hysias, was a banker, a man whose entire life was organized around money, its accumulation, its protection, and its exchange. The details of what happened next are disputed, but the broad outline is clear. Diogenes and his father were implicated in a scandal involving the adulteration of the local currency. Whether Diogenes was directly responsible, complicit, or entirely innocent depends on which ancient source you read. What is certain is that he was exiled from Sinope, his father's career was destroyed, and Diogenes found himself in Athens with nothing, no money, no reputation, no social position, no plan. He had been stripped, by circumstances he may or may not have controlled, of everything that his society said a person needed to be someone. And what he discovered, in that condition, was something that would become the foundation of his entire philosophy. He was fine. Not just surviving. Fine. The things he had lost turned out to weigh more than they were worth. Without them, he could move. Without them, he could think. Without them, he was, for the first time, entirely himself. He went to Antisthenes, a student of Socrates who had developed the earliest version of what would become Cynic philosophy, the idea that virtue, not wealth or pleasure or reputation, was the only real good, and that virtue required nothing external to express itself. Antisthenes, by most accounts, did not initially want to teach Diogenes. He turned him away repeatedly. Diogenes kept coming back. When Antisthenes threatened to hit him with a stick, Diogenes reportedly offered his head and said that no stick was hard enough to drive him away as long as Antisthenes had something worth saying. This persistence, this complete indifference to rejection and social pressure, this single-minded focus on what actually mattered, was not a pose. It was the philosophy already in practice, before Diogenes had fully articulated what the philosophy was. He lived in Athens for decades, and what he built there was the most radical philosophical experiment the ancient world produced. He owned, at various points, nothing but a cloak, a walking stick, and a wooden bowl, and when he saw a child drinking water from cupped hands, he threw away the bowl. He slept in a large ceramic storage jar in the marketplace, which ancient sources describe variously as a pithos or a barrel. He ate, slept, and lived every aspect of his daily life in the open marketplace, with a deliberate refusal to separate private existence from public space, on the explicit philosophical grounds that if an act was not shameful, there was no reason to hide it, and if it was shameful, you should not be doing it at all. He begged for his food, but not with the apologetic posture of someone who needed charity, with the calm entitlement of a man who had simply decided that his time was more valuable than his dignity, and that his dignity did not, in any case, depend on what other people thought of it. The behavior was not random provocation. Every act was a philosophical argument made with the body rather than with words. When Plato defined the human being as a featherless biped, Diogenes brought a plucked chicken to the academy and announced, "Here is Plato's man." When he walked through Athens in broad daylight carrying a lit lantern, and people asked him what he was doing, he said he was looking for an honest man. When he was sold into slavery, an incident that is historically documented and philosophically significant, and the auctioneer asked him what he could do, he said, "Govern men." He was purchased by a man named Envied of Corinth, who made him tutor to his children. Diogenes taught them philosophy, physical training, and self-sufficiency. When Envied later asked his friends what he could do for the old philosopher who was technically his slave, they told him, "Do what he says." The slave was governing the master. The point was not lost. He was a contemporary of Aristotle, and the contrast between them is one of the most illuminating juxtapositions in the history of philosophy. Both men were thinking, at the same moment in the same city, about the same fundamental question: what does it mean to live well? Both arrived at answers that overlapped in ways that might surprise you, and if you have watched our video on eudaimonia and Aristotle, you will already understand something of what cynicism and Aristotle's philosophy share. Aristotle argued that most people pursue the wrong things, wealth, pleasure, status, and mistake these for the genuine good, which is the active development of human capacities toward their highest expression. Diogenes agreed completely. Where they parted ways was in the method. Aristotle believed that the good life was lived within society, through relationships, institutions, and the cultivation of virtue in a social context. Diogenes believed that society itself was the problem, that its conventions, its hierarchies, its elaborate systems of approval and disapproval were precisely the mechanisms by which people were prevented from living according to their nature. Both men were right about the diagnosis. They disagreed about the cure. Aristotle's cure was to reform your relationship with society. Diogenes' cure was to walk away from the game entirely. The word that Diogenes used for this condition of complete self-sufficiency was autarkia, the state of needing nothing outside yourself to be fully yourself. It was not poverty. It was not deprivation. It was the systematic elimination of every dependency that was not strictly necessary, until what remained was a human being operating without the weight of performance, without the anxiety of reputation management, without the constant background noise of other people's opinions determining the texture of your inner life. Most people never reach this state because they never seriously attempt it. They are too embedded in systems of approval, the job that requires them to behave in certain ways, the social circle that requires them to maintain certain appearances, the identity that requires constant external validation to feel real. They have traded their freedom for comfort so gradually and so completely that they no longer experience the trade as a trade. They experience the constraints as simply the way life is. Diogenes watched this and felt something that he expressed not with sadness but with the specific impatience of someone watching people voluntarily choose their own cage. He did not moralize. This is important. He did not tell people they were bad or wrong or sinful. He demonstrated. His entire method was demonstrative. He showed, with his body and his choices and his complete absence of shame, that the things people believed they needed were not necessary, that the life they believed was impossible was being lived, that the freedom they deferred indefinitely was available immediately. When people pointed at his barrel and called it poverty, he pointed back at their expensive houses with their locked doors and their anxiety about thieves and their need for slaves to maintain them and asked who, exactly, was poor. When people mocked his diet, he pointed at theirs, the banquets that required hours of preparation and created hours of obligation and left everyone slightly worse than before, and asked who was actually eating well. He was not arguing that discomfort was good. He was arguing that most comfort was fake, that it created more problems than it solved, demanded more than it delivered, and consumed the energy that could have been used for something that actually mattered. He was old when Alexander found him in Corinth, old, unhurried, lying in the sun. The meeting between the world conqueror and the philosopher with nothing is usually told as a story about Diogenes' wit. It is also a story about two completely different answers to the question of what power is. Alexander had armies, territories, wealth, and the submission of millions of people. He was also, as his later years would demonstrate, deeply unhappy, restless, suspicious, increasingly isolated in the way that absolute power makes a person isolated, unable to trust anyone or rest anywhere. Diogenes had a cloak and a barrel and the sun on his face. He was not restless. He was not suspicious. He had nothing to protect and nothing to prove and nowhere he needed to be. When Alexander said he would give him anything, Diogenes asked him to move because he was blocking the light. Not because he was performing indifference. Because the sun was genuinely more valuable to him than anything Alexander could offer. He had done the accounting. He knew what things were worth. The cynics who followed Diogenes took his philosophy in various directions. Crates of Thebes gave away a substantial inherited fortune and lived as a wandering philosopher with his wife Hipparchia, who was herself a significant cynic philosopher, one of the very few women in ancient philosophy whose work was taken seriously. Their life together was, by all accounts, genuinely happy, a happiness built on nothing external, sustained by nothing external, requiring nothing external to continue. This was the proof of concept that Diogenes' philosophy demanded, that the life he described was not a theoretical ideal but a livable reality, available to people who were willing to actually live it rather than simply admire it from a distance. He died in Corinth in approximately 323 BC, of causes that no ancient source agrees on, which feels, somehow, exactly right for a man who refused to be pinned down about anything. When people asked him how he wanted to be buried, he said to throw him outside the city walls. When they expressed concern that he would be left for animals, he asked them to leave him a stick so he could drive them away. When they pointed out that he would not be able to use the stick because he would be dead, he said, "Then what does it matter?" The point, as always, was the point. What cynicism offers the contemporary world is not a lifestyle recommendation. Almost no one is going to give away their belongings and sleep in a barrel. That is not the lesson, and it never was. The lesson is a question, and it is a question that Diogenes posed simply by existing the way he did. How much of what you are you doing because you actually want to do it, and how much are you doing because you are afraid of what people will think if you stop? How much of your life is genuinely yours, chosen deliberately, reflecting your actual values, oriented toward things that matter to you, and how much of it is performance, obligation, the accumulated weight of other people's expectations that you have been carrying so long you have forgotten it is not your own? This is not a comfortable question. It was not meant to be. Diogenes spent his life making people uncomfortable in exactly this way, and the people who were made most uncomfortable were, by and large, the people who had the most to lose from honest accounting. The people with the most elaborate performances to maintain. The people most deeply invested in the game. They were the ones who walked past his barrel and felt, without quite being able to say why, that the old man lying in the sun was somehow freer than they were. They were right. He was. And the distance between his freedom and theirs was not measured in possessions. It was measured in honesty, in the willingness to look at what you are actually doing with your one life and ask, without flinching, whether it is what you would choose if you were not afraid. The barrel is gone. The marketplace where he lived is gone. The city that called him a dog is gone. What remains is the question he made his life into, the question that every person who has ever felt the gap between the life they are performing and the life they actually want has felt pressing against them from the inside. Diogenes did not answer that question for anyone. He only demonstrated, for the entirety of his long, unbothered, sun-warmed life, that the answer was possible. That the other side of the performance existed. That someone had been there, and had found it worth the trip,